The workshop was always quiet, too quiet almost. The smell of varnish, dust, and wood lingered in the air, and the faint sound of a scraping knife against porcelain was the only rhythm that marked the passing of time. It had once been a place of joy, where the dollmaker's hands skillfully crafted lifelike dolls for the families of Russia, each one a work of art. His reputation had spread far and wide, and people marveled at the delicate beauty of his creations. But that was before the accident. Before his world came crashing down in an instant. His daughter, Elena, was his pride and joy. Bright-eyed, curious, with a smile that could light up even the darkest room. She was his muse, the reason he poured so much love and care into every doll he made. She would often sit beside him as he worked, her tiny hands holding a paintbrush, helping him with the smallest details. She'd hum little songs while watching him carve faces, as if the dolls themselves were alive, sharing in her joy. But the day Elena died, everything stopped. The memory of that day would never leave him. The scream of the brakes, the crash, the shattering of glass as the car slammed into the tree. Elena had been in the passenger seat, and when the doctors told him she was gone, it felt like his heart had been ripped from his chest. The world he knew had collapsed, and in its place, a suffocating emptiness grew. In the days that followed, he became a ghost. He no longer cared for his work, and his once thriving shop stood still, abandoned by customers and by the man who had poured his soul into it. But the silence was unbearable. It gnawed at him, and every night he would hear her voice. Soft, faint, almost like a whisper. At first he thought it was just his grief playing tricks on him, a mind unraveling from the pain of losing a child. But then one night as he sat in his dimly lit workshop, a strange sensation washed over him. He felt her presence, Elena, as if she were right there with him. The air grew colder, and then he saw it. A doll, unfinished on the workbench, began to move. The doll was nothing extraordinary, just another porcelain figure in his collection, but its eyes were different. They seemed to glow in the dim light as if alive, and for a moment he swore he saw Elena's face reflected in them. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible? Could his daughter somehow have left a part of herself behind in the doll? His hands trembled as he reached for the doll, staring at its delicate features. The whispering came again, clearer this time, like a soft call. Papa? His heart froze. It sounded like Elena's voice. Was it really her? Or was he losing his mind? As the days passed, the whispers grew louder. The dollmaker found himself drawn back to the workshop, consumed by an unshakable need to create. But this time it wasn't just art, it was something far darker. The dolls he crafted no longer served as simple toys for children. They became something else, something that had a purpose he couldn't understand. The more he worked, the more he began to feel the pull, like a connection, a bond between him and the dolls. Each one seemed to hold a piece of his daughter's spirit, her essence trapped in their porcelain frames. But as his obsession deepened, so did his fears. He no longer knew if he was creating life, or simply trapping souls in endless torment. Before he knew it, he had been making dolls for weeks, driven by an unexplainable force. And with each new creation he could feel something stirring within him, a desperate need to bring Elena back. But what if it wasn't just his daughter's spirit he was channeling into these dolls? What if, in his grief, he had started to summon something far more sinister? If you've made it this far, I have to ask, are you intrigued by what's to come? Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on the next part of this chilling tale. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. As the dollmaker continued his work, he had no idea that he had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. It started subtly, like a breeze just brushing against his skin, too soft to notice unless you were paying attention. At first, the dollmaker chalked it up to his mind still reeling from the shock of his daughter's death. He would find things out of place. Tools moved, a doll on the shelf slightly turned, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Nothing too alarming. But there was a coldness that settled in his workshop, an unnatural chill that made the air feel heavy. Even in the warmth of summer, his breath would condense in the air as if winter had claimed the room early. The whispers started a week after he returned to his work. It was late as always, the quiet of the night wrapping the house in solitude. He'd been carving a doll's face, his hands mechanically moving as he had done so many times before. But tonight was different. Tonight, as he shaped the doll's lips, he heard it, a soft whisper. It was so faint, so distant that he thought maybe it was the wind. He stopped, looked around, but saw nothing. The whisper came again, this time clearer. Papa. Papa, help me. He froze. His breath hitched, his hands trembling as he placed the doll down, the carving knife slipping from his fingers. He looked around the empty workshop, a sense of dread slowly creeping up his spine. No one was there. It was just him, alone in the silence. And yet, that voice sounded so familiar. His daughter's voice. His heart raced, his mind scrambling to find a reason, any reason to explain what had just happened. He dismissed it at first as a product of his grief, his mind playing tricks on him, like so many other things had since Elena's passing. But over the next few days, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Every night as he worked, the same voice would drift to him from the shadows, calling his name, begging for his help. "Papa, I'm cold. Come back to me." It was no longer just a whisper. It felt like a presence that lingered in the corners of the workshop, that brushed against him when he wasn't paying attention. The sensation of eyes on him, watching him as he worked, grew unbearable. And it wasn't just the voice. It was the feeling, the strange, otherworldly feeling that she was there, not in the physical form he remembered, but something else, something just out of reach, like a shadow in his peripheral vision. One evening, as the whispers grew unbearable, the dollmaker sat before his workbench, staring at the unfinished doll in front of him. He had been carving it for days, shaping its face meticulously, but it felt wrong. Every time he tried to perfect the doll's features, something about it resisted. The face seemed too sharp, too hollow, as if something was missing. Then it happened. As he gazed into the doll's unfinished eyes, a flash of light filled the room. He blinked, startled, and there, just for a moment, was the fleeting image of Elena's face. Her eyes, her smile, her delicate features that he had loved so much. It was as if she were right there, staring back at him from the porcelain. The room seemed to pulse with energy, and for a heartbeat, he could almost hear her laughter, feel her presence. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a chill ran through him. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. But the image vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the doll, staring back at him with empty eyes. For the first time since her death, the dollmaker felt a spark of hope. This was it. This was the sign he had been waiting for. She was still there somehow. He could feel it deep in his bones. If he could just finish the doll, maybe, just maybe, he could bring her back. From that moment he became consumed. The whispers no longer felt like a warning, they felt like a calling. The dollmaker, once driven by love and artistry, was now driven by something darker, more desperate. He began to carve with an urgency he had never known before, staying up late into the night, his eyes bloodshot and wild. The dolls were no longer mere creations to him, they were a means to an end, a way to bring Elena back. But as his obsession grew, so did the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The dolls he made didn't feel the same as they once had. There was something wrong about their eyes, their expressions. They weren't just lifelike, they were alive. And with each passing day, the whispers grew louder, the presence stronger. Elena was calling him, but not in the way he had hoped. The dollmaker was no longer sure who he was working for. The workshop had become a place of fevered intensity, the silence only broken by the rhythmic sound of the dollmaker's hands carving and shaping. But now the air had thickened. There was something different about his work, a shift that he couldn't quite explain, but he could feel it deep in his bones. It wasn't just the presence of his daughter anymore. No, this was something else, something darker, more potent. In his obsession to bring Elena back, the dollmaker began to experiment, pushing boundaries he had never crossed before. The dolls, once delicate and lifelike, now seemed to possess a haunting presence. He no longer cared about perfection or beauty. The need to bring his daughter back consumed him entirely, and in his desperation, he began to delve into something much darker. It started with the materials. He had always used the finest porcelain, the softest fabrics, the best paints to craft his dolls, but now nothing seemed to satisfy the unrelenting hunger gnawing at him. He needed something more, something that would bring them to life. He had heard stories of ancient rituals, of dolls that could be imbued with souls, of practices that could summon spirits from the other side. These were the kinds of things whispered about in the darkest corners of old towns, where people spoke in hushed tones, afraid to draw attention to such unholy acts. But to the dollmaker, these whispers became a calling. If it was true that a doll could house a spirit, then he would do anything to make it happen. One night, after hours of frantic searching, he found an old, tattered book buried deep within the drawers of his father's desk. It was ancient, the pages yellowed with age, and the writing was in a language he couldn't quite understand. But it didn't matter. As he flipped through the pages, the images and symbols began to make sense to him, like a memory stirring in the back of his mind. The rituals, the sacrifices, the way to bind a spirit to an object. Everything was there. He began collecting items. Ashes from a fire that had burned the remains of an old church, hair from children that had gone missing in the area. Local rumors said they had never been found, just disappeared without a trace. He even took small, personal items, pieces of clothing, toys, and belongings that once belonged to those children, their identities erased from the world. With each piece, the sense of Elena's presence grew stronger. She was with him, guiding him, urging him to continue. His hands moved with a determination that was almost unnatural, and the dolls he crafted took on an eerie, unsettling quality. Their faces, though finely painted, seemed to twist in strange ways when he wasn't looking directly at them. Their eyes, those hollow, glassy eyes, no longer just reflected light. Now they seemed to watch him, following his every movement. The Dollmaker couldn't stop. His obsession was all-encompassing. He worked through the nights, his body growing weak from exhaustion, but his mind clearer than ever. With each new doll he could feel something else, a deep, unholy connection. The dolls were no longer lifeless figures of porcelain and fabric. They had become conduits, gateways. And with each new doll, a new presence emerged. He didn't understand it at first. The whispers in the workshop grew louder, now unmistakable. They weren't just the soft murmurs of Elena anymore. No, these voices were different, more urgent, more insistent. At first he thought they were just his imagination, but soon he realized he was not alone. One night, as he added the final touch to a new doll, he felt a strange energy surge through him. The air crackled with an unnatural force, and the workshop seemed to pulse with a life of its own. He watched in awe as the doll he had been working on for days slowly moved. Its tiny hand twitched, then its head turned as if it had a mind of its own. For a moment he froze. The doll's eyes locked onto his and a chill ran down his spine. Was it Elena? Had he really brought her back? Then just as quickly, the doll's face twisted into a grotesque grin, and the voice that came next was not Elena's. It was something darker, something evil. Papa, why do you keep trying to bring her back? She's never coming back. The Dollmaker stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. The room seemed to spin as the dolls, now all staring at him, seemed to whisper in unison. He could feel them, those lost souls trapped in the porcelain, clawing to be free. He had gone too far. But it was too late. The dolls he had created weren't just vessels for Elena anymore. They were filled with something else, something far more malevolent. And now they were awake. If you're on the edge of your seat, just wait. The darkness is only just beginning. Make sure to like and subscribe because you don't want to miss what happens next. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow through the dusty windows of the Dollmaker's workshop. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax, and the only sound was the rhythmic scraping of his tools against porcelain. He had been working for days, hardly sleeping, hardly eating, his hands moving with an almost unnatural precision. The doll that sat on the workbench before him was like none he had ever made before. This was the one, the vessel that would carry Elena's spirit back to him. As he finished the last delicate touch, a chill ran down his spine. The doll was perfect. Its porcelain skin was smooth and flawless, its tiny hands folded delicately in its lap. Its eyes, those eyes, were glassy and deep, reflecting a world that felt far away. But it was the face that unsettled him most. It looked so much like Elena's when she was little, when she would sit by his side and watch him work, her tiny fingers tracing the edges of his creations. He could almost hear her laughter, feel her presence in the room. He leaned in, his breath catching in his throat. "Elena?" he whispered, his voice shaky. "Is it you?" For a moment there was nothing. Just the creak of the old house settling and the sound of his own racing heart. He waited, holding his breath. Then a faint sound, a whisper almost imperceptible, came from the doll. "Papa, I'm here." The Dollmaker recoiled, his hands trembling. The voice, it was hers. He could feel the tears prick at the corners of his eyes. This was it. His dream, his desperate wish had finally come true. He had brought her back. But then, as if to mock his joy, the doll's head tilted slightly to the side, its glass eyes staring directly at him. The air in the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer. The doll's lips parted again, but this time the voice wasn't quite right. It was faint, distant, like a memory struggling to surface. "Why did you leave me behind, Papa?" The Dollmaker froze. The words sounded like Elena's voice, but something was off. Something was wrong. His pulse quickened. The doll's eyes, those eyes that had once been so innocent, were now filled with a strange, hollow emptiness. It felt as though something else was looking back at him, something dark and ancient, something that shouldn't have been there. He took a step back, his mind racing. It couldn't be. He had done everything right. He had followed the rituals. He had infused this doll with everything, his love, his grief, his soul. And yet, this didn't feel like Elena. For a moment, doubt crept into his heart. Was this what he had wanted? He had longed for her return, but now that she was here, something about it didn't feel like the miracle he had imagined. The air felt heavier, the shadows darker. The doll's presence in the room seemed to grow, filling the space with a sense of foreboding. As he stood there, torn between awe and terror, the doll shifted in a way that sent a jolt through his body. Its tiny hand twitched. Then, slowly, its fingers curled into a fist. And then the voice, it wasn't Elena's anymore. "Papa, you don't understand. You shouldn't have done this." The dollmaker's heart stopped. The voice was cold and unfamiliar, yet it carried a weight that he couldn't explain. It wasn't his daughter. It wasn't a sign of hope. It was a warning. A slow realization dawned on him. The dolls, these creations he had poured every ounce of himself into, weren't just vessels for spirits. They were something else. Something darker. Something that fed on grief, on desperation, on souls too fragile to withstand the weight of what they were becoming. He had made a terrible mistake. The first doll had come to life, but not in the way he had imagined. It was as though it had been waiting for him, for the moment he would cross the line. And now the curse was beginning. With every doll he made, the spirits that he thought he had summoned were turning against him, their voices growing louder, their presence more malevolent. "Papa, you'll never be alone again." As the doll's eyes locked onto his, the dollmaker felt a coldness seep into his soul. He had invited something terrible into his life, and now it was too late to turn back. The once quiet town, nestled deep in the woods, had begun to change. Whispers of missing children spread like wildfire, and with every passing day, another child disappeared without a trace. The townspeople were frightened, desperate for answers. But the dollmaker, alone in his workshop, knew the truth. He had heard the cries, felt the pull of their souls. It was his doing, he had trapped them. At first, it had seemed like a coincidence. Just one child here, another there, disappearances that could be explained away by the rumors of wild animals or the dangers of the woods. But soon it became impossible to ignore. The children were vanishing in a pattern, and the timing was too perfect. Every time a child disappeared, the dollmaker felt a strange compulsion rise within him. It was as though the loss of another soul was the trigger he had been waiting for. He was compelled, drawn into his workshop to create another doll. With trembling hands, he would reach for the tools once used to shape innocent toys, now tainted by the weight of his dark intentions. He could feel the cold presence of the dolls in his workshop, watching, waiting, urging him on. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, and he knew that there was no turning back. Each doll he created was not just an imitation of a child, it was a prison. A prison for the soul of the lost child, forever trapped in the cold embrace of porcelain. The dolls had become more than mere objects. They were now the vessels for something far darker, something that had begun to consume him. He could no longer separate himself from his creations. His obsession had taken root in his mind, and each doll he crafted felt like a step deeper into madness. His hands would tremble as he worked, not just from the weight of his guilt, but from something else. The dolls seemed to demand more souls, more victims. The children who had gone missing, the ones who hadn't yet been trapped in porcelain, had become nothing more than shadows in the town. The parents searched frantically, their grief growing by the day, but the dollmaker knew. He could feel their presence in the air, the cries of the lost souls calling out to him, pleading for release. But release wasn't an option. Not now. Not when the dolls had taken control. One evening, as he worked late into the night, he made a horrifying discovery. The dolls in his workshop, those he had so carefully crafted, each one infused with a spirit, had begun to move. It started subtly. A tilt of the head, a soft whisper. But then, as he watched, one of the dolls shifted its position. Its tiny hands, once folded gently in its lap, now reached out, fingers curling toward him. The dollmaker froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The doll's eyes, once lifeless, were now filled with something else, something alive. He could hear the faintest murmur, a voice that seemed to echo in his mind. "Papa, help us," he gasped, stepping back in terror. The voice was not Elena's anymore. It was something different, something wrong. The dolls were no longer mere vessels for the souls of the lost children. They had become hungry. Their spirits were restless, seeking to consume more. The dollmaker's mind raced. Had he created monsters? Had he invited something far worse into this world than he had ever imagined? He tried to stop, to break free from the compulsion that had taken hold of him, but it was too late. The dolls were now in control. He was no longer the creator, he was the servant. He could feel their presence all around him, cold and oppressive, urging him to make more. With every doll he completed, another child would vanish. The town was drowning in grief, but the dollmaker's soul was sinking deeper into darkness. The dolls would not stop. They would never stop. Each new creation, each new soul trapped, fed their hunger, and the workshop became a prison. A place where time no longer existed, and the boundaries between the living and the dead had dissolved. "You cannot escape us, Papa," came the whisper again, this time from multiple voices, rising in unison, echoing through the walls of the workshop. The dollmaker sank to his knees, his body shaking with dread. The dolls had taken control, and there was no going back. He had trapped them, yes, but now they had trapped him. The boundaries between the living and the dead had become indistinguishable in the dollmaker's workshop. What had begun as an innocent attempt to hold onto the memory of his beloved daughter had morphed into a nightmare that consumed him whole. Each doll he created had become more than just an eerie imitation of a lost child. It had become a gateway, a vessel for souls, a prison of pain, and a relentless hunger that devoured every ounce of his sanity. The whispers had started as a faint murmur in the dark, barely noticeable, almost like the wind. But now, the voices of the children trapped within the dolls were no longer subtle. They spoke loudly, clearly, with a desperation that chilled his very bones. They called to him from the shelves, from the corners of his mind, urging him to create more. Their voices were hollow, distorted, yet unmistakably filled with a yearning for release. "Papa, please, let us out." The dollmaker's hands shook as he worked, his once sure movements now clumsy and frantic. He had lost track of time, his world reduced to the grim reality of his workshop. It had become his prison, no longer a place of craftsmanship but a chamber of horrors, where every flick of his chisel deepened his torment. The voice of his daughter, Elena, had grown stronger in the cacophony of whispers. She was no longer just a faint memory of the child he had lost. No, she had become something else. Her voice echoed in the empty spaces of the room, filling his mind with a suffocating presence. He could hear her pleading, her sobs, her demand for more dolls to join her collection. "Papa, you promised more, please? I can't be alone." The dollmaker's heart twisted as he felt his daughter's spirit tug at his very soul. He had never intended for this to happen. All he wanted was to hold on to her, to bring her back, to make sure she was never lost to him again. But he had miscalculated. He had opened a door to something far darker, and now it was consuming him. As the days blended together, the dollmaker could no longer tell where reality ended and the curse began. The dolls, once mere figures of porcelain, had become his tormentors. Their eyes followed him as he worked, their smiles mocking him, their whispers growing louder until they drowned out all other sound. He was trapped in their world now. He had fed the curse, and it had taken root in his very soul. One night, as he sat hunched over his workbench, struggling to finish another doll, he was struck by a sudden realization. The dolls weren't just vessels for the souls of the lost children. They were the very manifestation of his obsession. The more he created, the deeper the curse sank into him. His hands were no longer his own. They were guided by a force he could not control. Every brushstroke, every stitch, was a surrender to the darkness that had overtaken his soul. He could feel it now, the weight of his own madness. His once clear mind was clouded with the whispers of the dolls, the desperate cries of the children, and the insistent voice of his daughter. She wasn't just asking for more dolls, she was demanding them. Demanding that he feed the curse, that he feed her. "You've come this far, Papa," Elena's voice whispered, sweet and chilling all at once. "You can't stop now. If you do, I'll be all alone." The dollmaker's chest tightened as he looked at the dolls around him, their cold, lifeless faces staring back at him. His mind was a blur, but deep down he knew. He had made a terrible mistake. There was no escape. The curse had him, body and soul, and there was no undoing it. Every doll he created tied him closer to the world of the dead, to a reality he could no longer escape. He tried to stand, to walk away from his creations, but his legs gave way beneath him. The dolls had taken root in his mind, and their whispers had become the only voice he could hear. His obsession had become his prison, and now the very thing he had feared most was happening. He was becoming one of them. "Papa, please," Elena's voice cried, now almost a command. "I need you to finish what you started. I'm waiting." The dollmaker looked at the half-finished doll in his trembling hands. He knew deep down that no matter how many dolls he made, it would never be enough. The curse was endless, and there was no escaping it. Not for him, and not for the children whose souls had been trapped in porcelain forever. He was no longer a man, He was a part of the curse, forever bound to the dolls and their haunting voices. And in that moment he realized that he had never been able to bring his daughter back. She had never truly left. She had always been with him, a part of the darkness he had embraced. The Dollmaker had created his own prison. Day by day the cursed workshop grew darker. The once calming hum of his craft had turned into the insidious, unrelenting sound of whispers, each doll calling out to him, their voices rising in crescendo. His mind was no longer his own, his body no longer obeyed his commands. The dolls had taken him. They had twisted him into something unrecognizable. For weeks, the Dollmaker had been haunted by one thought: how could he undo the terrible wrong he had done? The dolls had come to life, their cold, lifeless eyes no longer passive. They moved, they whispered, and worse, they controlled. He knew now that they weren't just vessels for the souls of lost children. They were prisons, and he was the latest inmate. One evening, as the clock struck midnight, a strange calmness washed over him. A voice, his daughter's voice, soft but insistent, filled his mind. "Papa, please stop. Stop before it's too late." The Dollmaker stood motionless, his hands trembling. His workshop seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick with the stench of decay. The voices of the trapped souls echoed through the room, louder now, pleading, begging him to stop. But it was too late, too far gone. With a sudden burst of desperation, the Dollmaker grabbed the nearest doll, a grotesque figure he had crafted in his madness, and raised it high. He was going to destroy them all. He had to. If he could just break them, if he could sever the link between the souls and the porcelain, he might have a chance to free himself from the curse. He could no longer live like this, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. His trembling fingers gripped the doll tightly, and with all his strength, he smashed it against the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the room, but the moment the doll's fragments hit the ground, a chilling, unnatural silence followed. He looked around, heart pounding in his chest, only to find the others staring at him. The dolls' eyes gleamed with a malicious intent, their faces twisted in silent fury. And then it happened. One by one the dolls began to move. First it was just a twitch, a slight shift of the head. But then their arms began to jerk, their bodies contorting in grotesque ways. The Dollmaker tried to run, but his feet were rooted to the ground as if the very floor had swallowed him whole. His breath quickened, his heart raced, and in that moment he knew the dolls were not going to let him escape. The first doll lunged at him, its porcelain fingers wrapping around his throat with unnatural strength. He gasped for air, but the grip tightened. He tried to scream, but his voice was strangled by the cold hands of the dolls. His eyes darted around, and that's when he saw them, the faces of the children. They weren't just trapped in the dolls, they were inside the Dollmaker too. Their eyes mirrored his terror, their voices joining in a chorus of screams. His daughter's voice was the loudest of all. "Papa," she whispered, her tone now cold and distant. "You created us, and now you belong to us." The Dollmaker's heart shattered as the realization hit him. There was no escape. The dolls had claimed him. There was no undoing the curse. With one final chilling scream, he was pulled into the nightmare he had created, his body now just another addition to the collection of souls trapped forever in porcelain. As his form vanished, his workshop fell into an eerie silence. But the dolls, they remained. Their eyes followed anyone who dared approach, their whispers growing louder with each passing second. And so, the story of the Dollmaker came to a close. But a warning remained for anyone who might wander too close to his cursed workshop. The dolls are waiting for you. If you've made it this far, then you've witnessed the horrifying fate of the Dollmaker. The price of his obsession was too high, and the curse he unleashed still lingers, waiting for its next victim. If you dare, like and subscribe for more chilling tales that will keep you up at night. But remember, once you step into this world, there's no turning back. The story concludes with the Dollmaker's tragic end. His desperation to undo his actions leads to his downfall, as the dolls he created turn on him, pulling him into the nightmare he thought he could escape. In a chilling final note, the warning remains: the dolls are waiting, and their hunger is never satisfied.